The Middle East, or West Asia, sits at the very heart of global energy supply, and growing instability in the region is sending shockwaves through oil and gas markets worldwide. Well, what does all that mean for a country like Australia? Last Friday, I sat down with Mike Cook of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, ACT Branch, and the branch's membership to unpack how developments in the Iran conflict flow through to Australian fuel prices, energy security, and the broader economy, and what Australia should be doing about it. I hope you find this discussion useful.
Excellent. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this AIIA ACT hosted online lunchtime members event. I'm Michael Cook, part of the AIIA ACT executive, and it's my pleasure to host this afternoon's discussion and welcome you on behalf of the AIIA, where it's our mission to help Australians know, understand, and engage more in international affairs. Today's presentation is titled Energy Security and the Middle East, What It Means for Australia. And we are joined by Dr. Daniel Rossetto, who will break down what's happening in the region, why it matters, and what the ripple effects could mean for energy prices and physical supply around the world. Dr. Rossetto will provide an analysis of how events in the Middle East flow through to Australian liquid fuel prices, energy security, the broader economy, and what Australia should be doing about it. This will be more of an interview format. If you have any questions, please pop them through in the chat using the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and I will work them into the conversation. Before we kick off, just a bit about our speaker. Dr. Daniel Rossetto is a global energy security expert with over 25 years of senior executive experience across multinational energy and banking firms, including Enel and JP Morgan, and currently serves as faculty at Adelaide University's Institute for Sustainability, Energy and Resources. His career has been shaped by direct involvement in major energy security events, from managing oil product shortages in South Australia in 2001 to participating in Enel's fuel oil transition investments in Italy, and experience in the 2006 European gas transit crisis. Daniel continues to analyse contemporary energy risks through his Climate Mundial YouTube channel, highly recommended, with a particular focus on Australia's vulnerability to global energy shocks and policy options to strengthen national energy security. Daniel, thank you for joining us. To kick things off, just wondering if you would be able to provide us with an overview of what's happening in the region, including having a look at some of those key questions, what's happening, what it means for Australia, and what should we be doing about it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mike. And it's a pleasure to have the invitation to be here today. Just by way of background, if we look at what's happening today, I think we all know that bombing has largely paused, but parties are now seeking to position themselves for negotiations, and it's quite clear that all of the US, Israel, and Iran seem to be positioning themselves with maximalist type requests, which is very important, which kind of shows that identifying the zone of potential agreement at the moment is very difficult. We're now sort of getting on for 7 weeks after the initial bombing began on the 28th of February. In the meantime, while there was attempts made to engage in a ceasefire, the United States has actually continued with the blockade, what they call it, blockading of ports, and we can go into a bit more detail on that today, because essentially that's not happening in the Persian Gulf itself. Basically, the fleet, if you want to call it that, of the United States is positioned out in the Gulf of Oman, and that's largely because there are serious risks of being targeted and essentially giving the Iranian military a bit of target practice. if they go too close to the Gulf, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, and also the Iranian coastline. So that's a really important point. Iran, as we know, is actually resisting the blockade, and the purpose of the blockade really is to bring financial pressure onto the Iranian government such that they will eventually concede. So it's an effective economic warfare. Whereas Iran is taking the view that the longer that they hold out, and with oil prices and other commodities and things like that, lots of pressure being brought to bear in the Gulf region and also onto the United States from an economic perspective, and knowing that this is a midterm election year in the United States, Iran's strategy is to clearly drag this on for as long as possible and bring that economic pressure and political pressure back onto particularly United States, and then anticipate that United States would actually put pressure on Israel to halt its activities as well. So that's essentially the strategy that Iran is using. And in the meantime, I think this is very important because we don't often hear this covered in the mainstream media, in particular in Australia, is that yes, our ministers and the Prime Minister have been very successful at securing supplies from Asia of refined products and crude over the last few months. But what we now face is a situation where all of the tankers that were on the high seas already at the beginning of the conflict on the 28th of February have now either already made it to port, or the oil is now in the process of being refined and so forth. So there's actually now very limited opportunities for tankers that were carrying crude, particularly from the Persian Gulf, that have been on the high seas, to actually come in and provide supply. And so arguably the physical shortages that are implied by this constrained flow of traffic out of the Strait of Hormuz is actually about to really kick in. So that's an important point. And also to clarify, this is not something that necessarily gets covered broadly in the mainstream media. In terms of how this affects Australia, well, it has very serious effects. A couple of weeks ago, Tony Abbott was actually writing a column for The Australian, where he openly admitted that he was persuaded, or reluctantly persuaded, that global oil markets were so efficient that Australia, back in the middle of the last decade, really didn't need to have 90 days of crude reserves, which is the recommended level from the International Energy Agency, and then scaled back to around 30 days. So he openly discussed that he received that advice. So Australia's in a position now where we're importing, roughly 60% of what we consume in terms of refined products, from abroad, and the origin of the crude that goes into those refined products is very heavily weighted to the Middle East. So that makes Australia very dependent on the Middle East or West Asia for its refined product imports. And it also imports some crude from the Middle East, in addition to other places like Malaysia and so forth. So there are other sources for Australian crude, but the headline, which I guess I've been reporting on the channel since last year after the 12-day war, which I saw as being a red flag event for Australia. So I decided to start publishing some videos on the topic back then. The headline issue, though, is that Australia now only has essentially 2 operational refineries. And so, importing crude is one thing, but only having 2 refineries is quite another. So Australia is very exposed on this crisis. And I think in addition to the short-term supply management issues, we do need to, as a country, get our head around the longer-term implications of this conflict, the geopolitical implications, and the sort of, the movement towards, if you like, a multipolar world order. And I think this conflict has probably accelerated what a lot of people intuitively understood was happening previously, and arguably now also catapults Iran and possibly Oman as the partner country that can control the Strait of Hormuz into the realm of potential great powers in the global system. So that's something Australia will need to plan for. So I just put that down as a point on how this affects Australia. And then finally, before we open up for the questions, Australia really has some immediate challenges, which we know that are trying to manage supply when we've only got reserves of up to 30 days, and working with partner countries to ensure that can be met. But in the long term, I think Australia will need to conduct a very thorough review of its policy. And I say policy in a general sense, because this is going to touch everything. It's going to touch energy policy, foreign policy, defense policy, security related matters, and so forth. And I think this revision can't afford to wait until this crisis subsides. And so I think Australia's got some work to do to deal with the immediate issues, but also prepare for the future, which is going to be quite different to what it was before the 28th of February. And on that note, I will just conclude by saying that this really is a major inflection point for Australia. There will be a lot of temptation, I think, in the coming months to propose things that involve Australia becoming self-sufficient. I think that temptation needs to be resisted somewhat. We need to be very clear-eyed about the selection of policy approaches that we're going to take going forward, and not react, in a sort of an overly protective way. But on that note, those are my introductory remarks, and I'll hand back to you, Mike.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and appreciate you providing that contextual overview of what the situation means for Australia and what's happening in the Middle East. Just a reminder, if folks would like to submit questions, you can do so using the chat function, and I'll work that into the conversation. First off, Daniel, just noting your work analysing previous global oil shocks, including those from the 70s. The Middle East has historically had periods of instability, whether that be conflict, social upheaval. What makes this situation different or more significant than previous disruptions, and how does that relate to the geopolitical and geoeconomic context?
Essentially, if we look at the last major oil shock that occurred globally, that's on a parallel or close to a parallel to this one, was the OPEC oil embargo in the 1973 and 1974, which I studied extensively. And I guess the issue was OPEC is a multinational cartel that was working to coordinate efforts to restrict supply, create pressure on the United States, but also Western countries to change policy relating to Middle East and West Asia activities. But it relied very heavily on coordination among OPEC members, and I guess the incentives to eventually break ranks among OPEC members is quite strong, was quite strong then, and so basically it relied upon coordinated interests of the OPEC members in order to carry on, and it had a specific intention behind it, and that was a policy change being forced in the Western world. This crisis is quite different because it no longer relies on a multitude of countries to actually influence the oil coming out of the Persian Gulf. And now you have effectively Iran, one country, and Oman as well as the partner country on the other side of the strait, who've now effectively got control of this very important physical choke point. So it doesn't rely on international cooperation as much as OPEC. I mean, there will be cooperation needed between Iran and Oman, and that puts Iran now into a very, very significant position of strength. And there isn't that much that anyone else can do about it, unfortunately. And over time, the Gulf countries that not only want to get oil and other exports out of the Strait of Hormuz, but also would like to get food and other things into the Persian Gulf that relies they rely on those imports for their survival, are probably going to need to shift a lot more closely towards Iran than they previously were. So I think this one, because of the physical nature of the constraint and the fact that Iran was able to do this because it was under attack, that's really important as well. That it's very different to the OPEC oil embargo, and essentially, that's why I think that there really has been a transition to something completely different to what we had become used to. And yes, there are other tensions and difficulties in the Middle East or West Asia, which we can go into, but this is a tectonic shift. I'll use that terminology.
You mentioned the concentration of influence and leverage in two countries, in particular, Iran and Oman, one of which Australia doesn't really maintain close or positive relationship with.
Yes.
How have energy markets factored in this kind of uncertainty as a result of this concentration of leverage and influence?
Not very well. And the reason I say that is because, following the energy markets and also listening to the sorts of pronouncements that come out of the US, more or less on a day-to-day basis, you can see a very direct correlation between the things that the US administration says, and in particular the president, and what happens in the oil market in the immediate aftermath. So what you can conclude from that is that the global oil markets are very, very sensitive to information flowing out of the White House and less sensitive to the general fundamentals of what's going on. And the reality is that, for example, when the ceasefire was originally announced, President Trump said that the Iranian 10-point plan was going to be the basis for the discussion. It formed a useful basis. But if anyone sort of really studied the 10-point plan, and I have to admit it was quite difficult to get an official copy of the 10-point plan, but the point number one was that ships would be free to sail through the Strait of Hormuz, provided that they coordinate with the Iranian military. That's a very significant point, and that one got brushed over a little bit in the financial markets. So I think the markets have been quite sensitive. Where I think we're just seeing a little bit of an uptick in the oil markets today, and I think under this realization that maybe with all the seaborne traffic that's been out on the oceans up until now, sort of coming to an end. There really does now need to be a conclusion to this, otherwise the uncertainty is going to really carry on. The other point, which is probably not as well factored into financial markets as it probably could be, is the impact that all this will have on the petrodollar. So as we know, the Gulf cooperation countries generally trade oil in US dollars and then reinvest the proceeds into United States financial markets. And if it is true that Iran is now taking control of the traffic through the straits, and there are no real alternatives, there are some alternatives, but none that caters for all of the volume, then there's another question about whether there's going to be an impact on the petrodollar and what that will do to the financial markets and so forth. And I don't think we've seen the beginnings of that being properly digested. So yeah, I think there's a few information asymmetries, probably some of them cultural. And over time, the realities of the situation are probably going to sink in.
And I think just wanting to delve further into those two issues, you mentioned the pronouncements or the impact of pronouncements from the White House, as well as the impact on the petrodollar. How have major and regional powers and players like the US, China, Iran, the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia positioned themselves, and what does it tell us about where things are headed? One thing I want to note is, I think, recent use of the UAE potentially withdrawing from OPEC that would have significant implications. What are your views on that?
The theory would suggest that, when something enormous like this happens, there is a period or an adjustment period where there's a degree of denial. And I think there has, up until now, probably been, some degree of imagining that this is not happening and life will go back to normal eventually. So in the context of some of the regional players, particularly the ones like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have so much at stake from this, I think it's very difficult to overstate how much is at stake for these countries. If you listen to the Iranian government spokespeople talking about these Gulf countries, they're really they have been concerned about the extent to which their facilities and their land was used or aided the United States in particular to attack it. So they feel very strongly, and they're also saying that at the end of this, they're going to be seeking essentially funds to reconstruct the damage. So there's a lot to go on here, and I think the digestion and processing of what's going on, especially countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, is only just beginning. I think there's going to be, like in terms of the United States, I think one of the possible consequences of this is there may be some questions asked about whether at least those Gulf countries, might still want to have United States military bases in their countries going forward. So that's going to have dramatic ramifications for what happens in the region. But I think importantly also, more broadly, is the world is digesting, not just with this conflict, but also to a certain extent with what's been happening in Russia and Ukraine, that there are very serious limits on the United States' ability to essentially compel countries to adopt particular political pathways and ultimately use military power to do that. And I think that's got tremendous ramifications as well, particularly for any next issues that come up. So I think there have been some very significant developments. But to answer your question very directly, Mike, I think we're only at the beginning of those countries being able to digest and understand everything, as well as what to do next.
I just want to touch on that petrodollar question. We do have a question from an audience member.
Yes.
I think it was as part of the 10-point plan, a toll imposed on tankers traveling through the strait, where the preferred currency was the yuan.
Yes.
I mean, that would potentially have the impact on the petrodollar. But more broadly speaking, what could happen to the Australian market where there are kind of implications and changes in petrodollar preference and currency?
Yeah, the financial impact or the financial market impact on Australia would be much less than this is really a matter affecting the US dollar. And I think there's probably more of a suggestion that the Australian dollar has been correlated in value with the yuan, much more so than it has with the US dollar over the last decade or so. So I don't think the financial market impact is going to be anything like it could be in the United States. But where Australia's quite exposed is that these supply chains, which some of them are very complex, a large amount of the crude oil that becomes the refined product that we consume in Australia is coming through that strait. So whether it's indirectly through Japan, China, or other South Korea, Australia's going to have to find a way to work with countries and essentially get these permissions that are going to be needed to secure the supply chains and get the crude out of the Persian Gulf, and then eventually get the refined product into Australia, which is clearly going to be necessary before Australia is able to do anything structural domestically to change that situation. So I see the impact on Australia as being more specific to oil, refined products, and also fertilizer, than it is on the financial markets. But that alone, those three or four things that I've just mentioned, are a very significant change for Australia, and it's going to, it's likely it's going to cost a lot more for oil in the short to medium term. And then some of the choices that Australia has at its disposal to diversify supply are also going to be more expensive. And so I think Australia needs to get its head around preparing for a higher cost environment for the next few years.
Now, I just want to move on to the next key question that we're looking at is in terms of how does this situation affect Australia?
Mm-hmm.
You've previously talked about Australia being a major producer of liquefied natural gas and a
Yes.
major exporter. Does this provide us with a buffer to deal with the strategic vulnerabilities that have emerged as a result of this conflict?
LNG, as a major exporter of liquefied natural gas, does put Australia into a good position because there are a lot of countries that are part of this complex supply chain on crude oil that I mentioned before, who do depend to a large extent on Australia's supply of liquefied natural gas. So there is a good basis for negotiating arrangements with those countries, which is a good sign, and it's a positive aspect. We have to be careful though, because you wouldn't want to be seen to be leveraging that LNG, and remember that there's also private companies involved here who may not necessarily want to do the exact thing that the government or the general public may wish to have happen. So, and you also don't want to overplay the leverage that one has in that area, or with any other commodity that Australia happens to export that is valuable, like iron ore, for example, and so forth. So that Australia has to be quite careful about balancing that. But the other really important one to point out here is that the crude oil that then goes into the gasoline, the diesel, and also the aviation fuel is really not an area, even though we're exporting a lot of LNG and producing a lot of LNG, that is not the type of fuel that can be easily used to substitute for demand for those petroleum-based products. So it's almost happening in a separate universe, that energy dominance that Australia has in gas terms, or for that matter in renewables. It's very much an electricity and stationary energy based type of energy, whereas this is really about transport fuels, and Australia is not very well positioned from a domestic production capability. So I see the LNG dimension as being positive in terms of its ability to generate foreign currency, so that there's money there to, or there's an ability to guarantee the convertibility of the currency, and then do deals, that align with the interests of other partner countries who are involved in this. But unfortunately, I don't see a lot of benefit of that profile for the immediate task of finding physical supply of petroleum-based products, at least in the next 3 or so years.
And just looking at the specifics of the energy supply chain, most Australians feel the disruption at the bowser. Can you walk us through the supply chain and how that instability in the Middle East affects prices in Canberra or right around Australia?
Yes. So essentially, the first and foremost market that's really important is the crude oil market, and that's probably the most liquid and the most transparent in terms of price discovery in the world. So we've got Brent crude, West Texas Intermediate. So we've got lots of pricing benchmarks globally, and essentially as those prices go up, Australia is a price taker. So it doesn't take long for those increases to flow through into retail fuel pricing. And we've seen, since the beginning of the conflict, I think we were down at somewhere around $70 US dollars per barrel, and it's now regularly pushing above 100, and so forth. So you can easily see how that is flowing through into Australian markets. In terms of the supply chains, there's also this dimension about refined product. And Australia is, I think it's around 60 or even 70% of the refined fuels, and that's all of the, gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel is basically being imported as well, which has a slightly different, I mean, it's related to the crude oil price, but it's also, there are slight differences there. And Australia's suppliers are countries like China, Singapore, South Korea, and so forth. So there's a lot of important partner countries in our region whose ongoing commitment to supplying Australia needs to be obtained. So this is a very significant moment for Australia in terms of the nation's ability to work with those countries who will clearly be needing to work with the issues in the Middle East as well to secure crude supply. But it's a very complex supply chain. And the other thing that affects the supply chain too, we even saw, I think last week, Indonesia started publicly talking about the Straits of Malacca as well. I mean, not that there's that much leverage to be obtained, certainly not to the same extent that Iran has over the Strait of Hormuz. But even that now introduces a new complexity into the potential supply chain as well. So yeah, it is very interesting and complex, but not impossible for Australia if it makes the right decisions about how to handle this.
And I think this is a good segue to move into the next series of questions about what should be done about it. You mentioned Australia and the government working closely with other governments and countries to shore up supply. We've seen recent visit from Foreign Minister Wong to China, for example, to shore up guaranteed supply to the market on aviation fuel, and Prime Minister's visit to multiple Southeast Asian countries. What do you think the policy objective was in undertaking those visits, and do you think those objectives were achieved?
Well, I think the immediate policy objective from an Australian standpoint would have been to, secure some supply for the next few months. So there would have been a very narrow set of objectives for Foreign Minister Wong and others on those missions. But of course, when they arrive, and I'm not party to those meetings, but I imagine the response would be, okay, well, we want to work with Australia. We want to make sure everything's okay and so forth. However, there's a few other issues that are important to us, and we need you to take these on board as well. So that's where the trade-off would come. Whether it be China, Japan, anywhere else for that matter, where Singapore, the alignment of interests with Australia is probably the strongest, but there are also some areas where they diverge. So that's the issue now. As Australia's dependence is being revealed in a more concrete way, our discussions and negotiations with those partner countries are going to become a little bit more tricky, because there are certain things where there's been non-alignment previously, where we may have to amend some of those positions. So I think it's a tricky balancing act, and Foreign Minister Wong has to balance the immediate priority of securing supply with the long-term impact that this has on our diplomatic position with those significant countries in our region.
Now, I do have a few questions, three of them, in fact, on the opportunity for R&D and innovation. So I'll try and work them in together. So the first is in relation to R&D priorities, and how should they shift in response to this crisis?
Yeah, well, I think I want to make, before I go into specific R&D related responses, I want to make a very important comment here about energy policy. And there's this term called the energy policy trilemma, where the need is balancing three competing policy objectives in energy policy. One is affordability, one is sustainability, environmental sustainability, and the third one is security. And it is very difficult, if not impossible, to ever find a single policy measure that addresses positively all of those three objectives. And I think we need to be clear-eyed about that in the first instance. And for the foreseeable future, Australia is dependent on liquid fossil fuels. That is now a reality that I think everyone can acknowledge. So to the extent that we've been maybe a little bit too weighted towards, in some quarters, the sustainability objective and getting rid of fossil fuels type slogans that you often hear and things like that, decarbonisation at any cost, those sorts of things. We now need to be a little bit more measured about that, I think, and start to say, okay, well, yes, we do want to make incremental movements towards net zero and things like that. But we also need we can't forget the security objective in energy policy. So I think that's point number one. And if you look at Australia's research and development priorities right now, there's no real direct correlation to energy security, at least that I can see. So I think that's going to have to change a little bit. And I think we already saw the National Reconstruction Fund and the minister concerned has already said, look, we're open to proposals to construct new refineries in Australia. That's a good start, but I think it needs to manifest as maybe a modification or a revision to Australia's R&D priorities, because that's the first signal for academics and for institutions around Australia to really target their proposals and their research activities. So I think, and that's one of, earlier I mentioned, let's not wait till this crisis is over, which may actually take a long time to be fully managed out, to review the policy settings. And that's one of them definitely is on R&D specifically as it relates to transport fuels for the nation.
And just staying on this discussion about policy, you've mentioned the need to, this trilemma of objectives and issues that need to be addressed through the pulling of policy levers. What readily available policy levers can the government pull or has already pulled to mitigate against the impact of this energy crisis on the Australian economy, as well as tackle those three issues that you just mentioned?
Australia has a few options, but none of them, other than finding supply from other, for example, finding the same supply but going to the Americas instead rather than to Asia, it's going to be much more costly. So there's an immediate trade-off between the affordability objective and the security objective would be to orientate a little bit more to the Americas. But other than those types of measures, Australia's ability to diversify its supply options, including having more of its own domestic production capacity, is going to involve fairly significant changes. And my early assessment is that at the moment, Australia does not have anything like the policy levers that would be necessary to engineer this type of transformation, to the extent that there was an objective set that a certain amount of domestic liquid fuel consumption needs to be supplied through domestic feedstock production and refined product. So there's going to need to be a lot of heavy policy lifting done in order to provide the incentives, because we're largely talking about private sector investment, and the private sector will only allocate the capital if there is a specific incentive or reason to do so, or an outlook that is particularly attractive. So that's an area, Mike, where I think there is a lot of work to be done, because we're not there as a country at the moment. And that's why I'm encouraging the government particularly to think about starting that work now rather than waiting until this particular crisis is over.
Mindful of time, I will ask a question about the elephant in the room that has featured quite heavily in political discourse, the Strategic Fuel Reserve. So there have been announcements about an expansion of the Strategic Fuel Reserve for Australia. Do we have the infrastructure to support such an expansion?
There's a number of possible constraints on that. One is infrastructure itself. The other is financing it, because those reserves are basically an accumulation, basically like a warehouse for fuel that needs to be paid for, but there's an uncertain time frame on when it will actually, or if it will ever be needed. So the private sector is not going to build those reserves unless they're told to do it, or unless there's an incentive to do it. So the infrastructure would need to be, or the cost of the infrastructure that needs to be included to give Australia that sort of capacity needs to be taken into account as part of the incentive design that's going to be structured. So I don't see, I mean, in the short term, this is a bottleneck, no question about it. So the diversification of import supply options and the need to work with partner countries and to find a way to, to secure supplies coming out of the traditional routes is priority number one. Absolutely no doubt about it. But aligned to that, going forward, and as we can, going back to the OPEC oil crisis and so forth, and the various crises that have sort of smaller crises, but still crises that have happened along the way, we can see this kind of happens semi-regularly. So let's not be too short-term in our thinking and understand that this is an issue that's not going away. And as much as Australia has tried fuel switching, to electric vehicles and things like this, and has done very well, we're not there yet. We're not at a point where we can rely on that totally. So I think the work needs to start, and this is going to be a challenge because of the political cycles that we work on are much shorter term than the need for this type of infrastructure. That's why I think this whole discussion needs to be bipartisan. It can't be something that has too much of a political dimension to it if Australia is to solve this particular problem.
Fantastic. And we're quickly running out of time, so I'll just ask one more closing question. If you were advising the government today, what's the one thing you would push hardest for?
I think that the issue that concerns me the most is that, and this makes me think about a discussion I had actually with Hugh White about a year ago when he came to Adelaide and gave a keynote presentation and actually spoke at the Institute's event in Adelaide. But we were talking afterwards, and he said, when he works with his students and so forth, people are talking about what sort of security does Australia need. He always asked the question, first of all, if you were going to attack Australia, how would you do it? As a starting point for then coming up with a rational and well thought out defence policy. And being an island and so forth is wonderful, but the issue that really comes to the fore now is that there isn't much defending of Australia that can be done in a scenario where we run out of liquid fuels. And so the government within all of this needs to really seriously address that question. Not saying that, there's any immediate threat, but certainly Australia doesn't want to leave itself in a position where it can be so close to not having enough fuel and then expect to successfully be in a position to, defend itself. So that would be my headline recommendation to government, is to think very seriously about bolstering resilience in that specific area, which could then have flow-on benefits for the broader economy once that's done.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to present to our members today on this timely topic. And if participants are interested in finding out more about your work, where can they find it?
Yes, so I've left the YouTube handle here on the screen. So it's at Climate Mundial, and my videos, I publish 3 videos per week at the moment, which ironically are very centered on this particular topic for the time being, at least. So I would encourage viewers to subscribe, and of course, if they do subscribe and watch the videos, please make comments and so forth, which really helps boost the community on the channel. So I'd very much look forward to that.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to our participants. For our participants, please keep an eye out on our future events, which are listed on the events page. A reminder that our next event at the ACT branch is on Wednesday, 6th of May with Dr. Lauren Richardson, on the two Koreas in the eroding global order. We look forward to hopefully seeing you there. Thank you again, Daniel. Really do appreciate you taking the time. And on that note, I'll formally close the session. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I hope you found this discussion useful. Subscribe to the channel for more coverage on energy, geopolitics, and what it means for Australia in practical terms. And as always, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of Climate Mundial. Bye for now.